All right, so just to kind of
Yeah,
bring you up to speed, I promised I would bring her up to speed in a sentence or two. So what we discussed 2 weeks ago is the Orthodox view of Revelation, okay, which I'm going to caricature, but I think not completely inaccurately, as Moses went up Mount Sinai with a tablet and a pencil, and God dictated the Torah to him for 40 days, and then and the Torah that we have now is exactly the same as what was revealed to Moses at Mount Sinai. All right, and then I went through why many people find that to be implausible. Okay, for all kinds of reasons, which you'll go back and watch the tape, and that's pretty much where we ended. And I left it. I said, oh, Ricardo's back. Hi, Ricardo.
How you doing?
Oh, you're not using a camera anyway, so I was gonna show you everybody who's in the room.
Hi, this is the first time I use it. I don't know exactly how this works.
So what I said was having, because I think some people found what I had to say both convincing and disturbing a little bit, and having sort of demolished that house, right now I need to rebuild it.
That's what the military does.
Okay, right. So, so the assumption, right, if you are not Orthodox, right, the assumption is that the Torah is not literally the Word of God in the same sense that it is for the Orthodox, okay? I mean, and here's the sort of philosophical rub. I mean, even if you want to maintain that the Torah, as we have it now, is 99.8% from God, right? But maybe there's a resh that should have been a dalet, or a dalet that should have been a resh, right? Or some, which is entirely plausible, right? The minute you've admitted that it is a mixture of divine and human material, right? So where do you draw the line? Right? Where do you draw the line? You say, well, everything from God except this one thing. Oh, that's your opinion. Maybe I say everything's from God except these two things, and you have no basis to argue against that, right? So now, what fundamentalists of all religions will do, I think, is to try and set up a false, what I consider to be a false binary, right? Either it's all the Word of God or it's nonsense, right? I mean, I remember freshman year of college, I had a professor for a course was called The Problem of God, and every freshman had to take it. And this professor, he was a Franciscan. And he later went on to become a very well-known theologian. He was in the news a couple of years ago because he had become like the sort of the enforcer of theological orthodoxy for the U.S. Catholic bishops. And anybody who criticized the Pope, he would go after like a pit bull. All right. And then he decided that Pope Francis had gone too far, and he went after Pope Francis, right? So the guy who was in charge of persecuting everybody who criticized the Pope criticized the Pope, so they fired him. Right, but he was basically an evangelical Catholic. In fact, this Mother of God,
Oh, yeah.
he was involved with them, Okay, he was involved with them. Yeah.
I know I pronounced that wrong. It's
Nader D.I.
Nader D.I.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Amateur is the favorite.
Right. Anyway, so, we were studying things in the New Testament, right? And he said, look, either you have to believe that Jesus was divine or a lunatic, right? And hoping, of course, that people would say, well, given that binary, I'm going to go with divine, right?
But it's a false binary.
But it's a false binary,
Right.
because how do you? I mean, it rests on an assumption that everything reported about Jesus in the Gospels is accurate, which, in point of fact, it can't be, because you have 4 Gospels and they contradict each other.
And then well, I'm sure.
Right. Right. So, so it's the same, I think, false binary that you'll get from what they call kiruv rabbis who are trying to reach out and bring non-Orthodox Jews to Orthodoxy, right? I mean, the 2 primary sort of branches of kiruv are Chabad and Aish, okay, which are very different from each other, actually. I mean, Hasidim and Misnagdim, but they're both sort of committed to the Orthodox view of Revelation and to convincing non-Orthodox Jews of its validity, right? So, but if you start from the assumption that the Orthodox view is not 100% credible, okay? And interestingly, about, 15 years ago or so, there was a book by a professor at Hebrew College in Boston, who's actually a professor of psychology. And the book was called The Persistence of Unreasonable Belief. Okay, and it was a study of why Orthodox Jews continue to believe something that to him is so obviously
Not
implausible, right? And he, having grown up Orthodox and then left that community, so he was, roundly attacked. But I find the persistence of unreasonable belief to be not at all surprising. I mean, all you have to do is turn on the news or
They shouldn't buy a white horse because they think they're the Lone Ranger.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Ron, I'm just curious, how is the modern Orthodox that's not Hasidim or the other, how do they fit into the picture?
Well, look, I mean, you cannot be, look, this is a dogma, okay? And the way orthodoxies work is that you cannot publicly reject a dogma. Right? No, that's the way it works. You cannot publicly reject a dogma. Nobody's going to grill you as to what you actually believe, right? But you can't publicly challenge it, right? And so, and there are people who simply live bifurcated lives, okay, which actually is fine. I mean, Stephen Jay Gould had a great phrase talking about religion and science. And he was, of course, talking about really, the hard sciences, but, and I'm far from a hard scientist, right? But, we call them the social sciences, right? Now, real sciences, I'm sure, laugh at that, but
social science is a soft science,
right? But we talk about the scientific study of the Bible, right? And so Stephen Jay Gould says that religion and science are non-overlapping magisteria.
I agree with him.
Right? Okay, so, and sometimes I feel that way too, right? I mean, if on Yom Kippur, right, I absolutely believe that my fate in the coming year is dependent on my prayer on that day, right? The rest of the 364 days of the year, I don't believe that, right? But on Yom Kippur, I do, right? Because in that sense, they're also sort of non-overlapping magisteria, right? And sometimes people will ask me a question, and I'll say, are you asking me as a rabbi, or are you asking me as a historian, right? Because my answer as a historian will be different than my answer as a rabbi, right? Because they are, in a certain sense, non-overlapping magisteria. Having said that, you will not find too many Orthodox Jews who are professors of Bible in universities, right? They could be professors now of biblical interpretation, right? In other words, I could teach you the history of what Rashi said, what Rambam said, what Nachmanides said, what Sforno said, what Ibn Ezra said, and I'm just telling you what they said, right? I need not have an opinion on whether their comments, accurately or inaccurately reflect the intention of the Bible, right? So an Orthodox Jew has no problem being a professor of biblical interpretation or a professor of archaeology or whatever, but of Bible in that sort of narrowly considered, there are very few. I can really only think of one, right? I mean, even John Levinson, who's Orthodox, but he really teaches New Testament at Harvard Divinity School. Only one. Right. The only one I can think of who teaches Hebrew scriptures was James Kugel at Boston University. I mean, there are not many Orthodox Jews who teach, and he had to write some books.
He did write,
reconciling.
That's right.
Where he basically said what I attributed to Stephen Jay Gould. This is what I believe in the classroom, and this is what I believe in shul. Right, but not everybody can live that way. All right, so now let's, pardon the phrase, reconstruct the Bible, right? And so we'll start with Kaplan, right? Mordechai Kaplan, who was the founder of the Reconstructionist movement, although, as I remember pointing out fairly recently, but I don't remember when or in what context, Reconstructionism was not a distinct denomination until about 1968, okay, when Kaplan founded the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College in Philadelphia. Kaplan was ordained at JTS. He was a faculty member at JTS. And until Kaplan founded the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, you could be a conservative Jew and a Reconstructionist. In fact, there are still a handful of congregations that are duly affiliated as conservative and Reconstructionist. One of them is in more or less in our Osei Shalom and Laurel is duly affiliated as conservative and Reconstructionist. But Kaplan spoke about the human impulse for religion, which generally occurs in communities. So for Kaplan, revelation is not top-down but bottom-up. Our ancestors discovered certain truths and values, and they gave them the name God. Okay, so for Kaplan, Torah is entirely a human product, and therefore we can adopt and adapt it in each generation. Right? So for Kaplan, there's no revelation in the sense that we normally understand that word. Right? That it is a process of human discovery of values and laws of nature and so on and so forth. Okay, that's Kaplan, right?
That's Kaplan. But part of that is how I feel. This was developed by humans, but I don't see, I don't go as far as he does.
Okay, well,
I'm with you.
Yeah.
right. Okay, so that's Catholic. So you're not a Caplanian,
Right.
right?
What's the difference between that and a Reformed person who doesn't really believe in God or revelation?
Well, because look, Reformed Jews by definition do believe in God. They absolutely. I mean, classical Reform does believe in God. Okay, so I mean, I'm trying to get through these in a kind of systematic order, right? Because
Glenn, one of the problems that you have is this issue of the divine in man, and I use that humans, the divine in humans,
right.
and if that is a spark of deity, then in a sense, it's not a real strain to say that this has a theological or a background from a higher being, and that it's sharpened and that it develops and that it changes as we go along. Some in a pragmatic sense, but some in just we always did it that way, so we still have to continue to do that. I think there certainly is an argument, and I think most modern people that I know who would buy into what I'm just saying would think that this really is of the divine, but also of the human. I'm not even sure where I'm going.
Right. No, I get it, and I think the one point that you make is really interesting, and I have to think more about it. That if you posit that there's a spark of divinity in humans, right? Which, I mean, certainly Kabbalah, Hasidism does, right? So then the distinction that I'm making between Torah as a divine document and Torah as a human document is also a false dichotomy.
That's right.
Right? I mean, now you have to be careful with that, right? Because, for example, if I'm discussing with Christians who really, are dead set on proselytizing, right? I'd say, well, of course Jesus was the Son of God. And then they get all excited. And I say, but so am I. So are you. Right? Right. So yeah. So if there is divinity in human beings, right, then just because something is a human product does not, if so facto, mean it's not also a divine product.
That's correct.
Right. That's really fascinating. I have to think more about that. But there's certainly, I mean, there's definitely merit in that perspective for sure.
Well, let me just say, Marcia, are you into that? Do you buy into that?
What
I just said?
But in a way, yes, because the way the way I look at it is a lot of things people needed something to explain what was going on. But I always felt in the back of my head that there was, do I really believe in God? But yet I think there was something driving that, and could be, the divine element of
a divine element.
A divine element, and how these things came about, were put together, and it gives a sense of comfort in a way that there is maybe something up there.
That's
that
what I think we get it from.
I agree with the say. I can eliminate the divine for me.
Right.
Otherwise, to me, it would be pointless unless you're just connecting on a cultural level to say prayers and everything. I mean, unless that's your way of connecting culturally. I do believe that you can look at the scriptures as also, a cultural thing. That people that don't believe in God can still be proud of their heritage because that's part of their heritage. But for me, I kind of feel like I still have to feel like there's something divine up there.
That came down.
I'm mixed. I'm kind of mixed too. I feel like there's something bigger, but I also really into kind of the spiritualism thing. which says it is part of all of us kind of, I mean, the only way to get there, that the whole country, world is at peace, is that we're all bring that, not that we're all praying to God, that we're actually bringing that divine spiritual peace out of us.
But I really think that's pretty commonplace among a certain strata of Americans.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, right. So let's explore how we get to that. Okay.
Exactly.
No, that's fine. It's great. It's very helpful. So now I want to talk about Franz Rosenzweig's view of Revelation. Okay, Franz Rosenzweig, probably the most important Jewish theologian of the 20th century for conservative and reform rabbis that most Jewish lay people have never heard of.
You mentioned his name before,
right?
And I just
and one look, frankly, one of the reasons why Rosenzweig is not well known is that he's really, 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 really difficult. Okay, I mean, he's up there with Wittgenstein as far as I'm concerned. All right, I mean, it's like I have his magnum opus, which of course he wrote in German in the 20s. Okay, so that gives you some idea, right? Actually, he started writing it while he was a soldier in the German army in the First World War, and he wrote it on paper that he could find wherever, and I have started and stopped it many times. And finally, one of my professors said you should really read it in Hebrew, that the Hebrew translation is easier to follow than the English translation, but it's still very, very, so Rosenzweig is really hard to follow.
I find that to get into the philosophy and things, I always have a hard time.
Yeah.
Following it. My mind just doesn't work.
Yeah, no, I think Kant is easy compared to Rosenzweig.
For me.
But
and I had a professor he's wonderful, and he could talk about anybody. He talked about Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann. And I'm thinking, boy, that's got to be the greatest book in the world. I started reading it. So what happened to it?
Yeah.
It was been destroyed.
Right. Well, very often, stuff is much more exciting in secondary literature than as a primary source. But Rosenzweig found a way to marry a scientific approach to text with a certain traditional reverence. Okay.
When you say scientific, what do you mean when you say scientific?
I mean the idea that the Bible is studied in a university the same way any other ancient text is studied. Okay, that it has a history, that you can tease out different sources, that we look at the history of its transmission, that we can compare, for example, right, one of the ways, like if you have a Hebrew text that seems to be impenetrable, right, and one of the reasons that it's impenetrable is because it seems that the text is corrupt, right? So, the two primary ways that we could try, and that's not even higher criticism, that's really lower criticism, right? So we look at the Samaritan text, right? And, does the Samaritan text make more sense than the Masoretic text? It might. Well, but if it does, you're outside the realm of orthodoxy now, because the Masoretic text is the text, right? Or you could look at the Septuagint, right? And then take the Septuagint and sort of retranslate that back into Hebrew, right? And sometimes you get emendations to the Hebrew text on the basis of the Septuagint that the text is no longer impenetrable. So these would be some of the techniques that, you know, would be part of what we call scientific biblical study.
And analytical.
Right, analytical, but you know, but the idea that it's not sacrosanct,
Right, exactly.
right,
Yeah.
and that you know, you study it the same way, you know, somebody in law school might study the Federalist Papers.
Right.
Okay,
It's a
with
piece of literature.
you know, with the obvious
It's
difference
really-
that there's not the language
Yeah.
barrier, right? But, you know, just like as I said 2 weeks ago, people who know that stuff better than I can look at a particular Federalist and say, oh, you know, can tell you who wrote it, or can take even, you know, one and say, well, the first part was written by this guy, the second part was written by that guy, right? All of that's completely out of bounds within normative orthodoxy, right? So I spoke about the documentary hypothesis, right? And I don't mean, I could spend a lot of time trying to explain or demonstrate it, but it's not necessary, really. But the documentary hypothesis posits that the Torah is made up of 4 sources: J, E, P, and D. Okay, J, which if it had, it's called J because it arose in a German-speaking milieu. If it had risen in a English-speaking milieu, it would be the Y source. Okay, these are the sources. Basic hallmark of these sources is that they use the tetragrammaton, Yud He Vav He, for God, and that's why it's called the J source. Okay, the E source are those sources that use Elohim for God. Right, the P source stands for priestly. Okay, that's mostly the book of Leviticus, but there are priestly materials in other books as well that deal with, you know, concerns of the priests, or also the genealogies, which to demonstrate that the priestly lineage, you know, is legitimate, right? And then the D source is the Deuteronomic source, which is mostly the book of Deuteronomy, but there's Deuteronomistic material in other books as well. And if you don't assume that the book is one work, you can see that Deuteronomy has a different theology than the rest of it, in the same way that, you know, if you're studying the Gospels, once you depart from the normative Orthodox Christianity, then you can see that the book of John has a different theology than the synoptic gospels, right? So you have J, E, P, and D, and then they were put together by R, which stands for redactor, right? And certain material is redactor material. It's put to smooth the transition between the different documents, okay?
And there's multiple, in some cases, there's multiple versions
of the same story. Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, you know, the Joseph saga is the classic one. I mean, and you can buy. I mean, I haven't seen one in a while, but you can buy like Bible, okay, which, you know, highlight each source in a different color, right? Now, obviously, you can go overboard with the documentary hypothesis, and then within the documentary hypothesis, different scholars attribute different materials to different authors, and so on and so forth. Right? It's not a unified. Which, of course, then you get, you know, to Ancient Torah and say, well, this is why it's nonsense, because they can't even agree among themselves, right? But so Rosenzweig says that he accepts the existence of J, E, P, D, and R, but for him, R does not stand for redactor, but rather Rabbeinu. Okay, that is to say, our teacher, right? In other words, it may well be true that the Torah is made up of different documents and different strands, right? But what makes us Jews is that book, right? And so whether it comes from God or not, right? This is the ground of our existence as Jews. So for Rosenzweig, who was an existentialist, Revelation is grounded in an actual historical event which took place at Sinai, but what was revealed was not words and letters, but rather God. Okay, and that's why it's called a theophany, right? The appearance of God at Sinai. At Sinai, the people encountered God, and they attempted to put into words an ineffable experience. Right? In other words, God appeared at Sinai, the Jewish people saw God, and then they tried to write down what they saw. Right? So that in a certain sense, you could say it's an entirely human product.
Right.
But it's a human product that is a result of a divine encounter. Right? You know, and therefore, so if you find contradictions in the text, it's because different people are human. They have different experiences, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons why, you know, a good cross-examiner, right? I mean, like for example, the one time that I was on a jury, right, and we acquitted the defendant, even though the majority of us believed that he had probably committed the crime of which he was accused, but the standard, right, the standard is not probably, it's proof beyond a reasonable doubt, right? But one of the reasons was that, so the defendant was accused of having bought crack cocaine, right? And so the police officer said, I saw him running down the street with a baggie, and then he threw it away before I got to him. The lawyer says, you saw him with a baggie. Yes, I did. Was it in his right hand or his left hand? Couldn't remember. Right? That's enough to sow reasonable doubt, right? Now, did he see it? Yeah, I'm sure he saw it, right? Did he remember it 100% accurately? Did they get the baggie? Yeah, they did. I mean, yeah, and the baggie had the, yeah, absolutely. We had it in the jury room, you know, with a marshal watching us.
Similar, the one time I was in the jury was a very similar trial. Yeah. The other problem was over a year after they actually. Well,
this was part of it too. Yeah, this was part of
it.
Right. Yeah, memories fade also.
Yeah.
Okay, so it wasn't the same trial because mine was in D.C. Mine was in D.C. So.
Rabbi, could you? Kind of goes, but I mean, could you believe were actually given by God, but the rest of the Torah was inspired by people in it?
Of course you could. I mean, having said, of course, that takes you out of orthodoxy. Right? Which, I mean, I'm not particularly interested in you being inside orthodoxy, so I don't care. Yeah, but yeah, sure. There are plenty who believe that. I mean, having said that, there are two different versions of the Ten Commandments, right? You know, they differ very slightly, but they do differ. You know, so even that is I mean, now the traditional commentators have a way of reconciling the two different versions, but you know, but having said that, I mean, for a very long time, normative rabbinic Judaism has really tried to get rid of that notion. I mean, for example, I mean, there are so many biblical texts in the Siddur. 10 Commandments is not in the Siddur, right? Why is the 10 Commandments not in the Siddur? Precisely lest people attribute excessive importance to it and say, oh, yes, only this was revealed at Sinai, right? I mean, scholars of liturgy say that, there's a lot of stuff at the beginning of the service that even those of you who come to shul regularly don't know because you're never there when we say that.
Right.
Right. But the 10 Commandments used to be towards the beginning of the morning service, and then they actually took it out of the Siddur precisely for that reason, because Christians were saying the only revelation at Sinai was the 10 Commandments, right? So we can't have anything that would possibly give any credence to that perspective. Okay, so Abraham Joshua Heschel, who really wrote the book. I mean, he wrote a 3-volume collection called Torah min Hashamayim ba'aspaklaria shel Hadorot. Torah from Heavens in the Mirror of the Generations, which was an abridged translation. The abridged translation is 600 pages by Gordon Tucker, called Heavenly Torah, where Heschel goes through what the rabbis actually believed about Revelation. Okay. But Heschel himself says, as a report about Revelation, the Bible itself is a midrash. Okay, in other words, which is, in that sense, similar to Rosenzweig, right? Revelation is real. Revelation occurred, right? But for Heschel, the Bible is a minimum of revelation and a maximum of interpretation. Right? It is not literally the product of God. It is the product of human beings trying to express what they learned from and about God.
But that's not surprising at all. You gave the example, the classic example, but it happens. You ask 4 people, if something happens, it's startled, and you ask what just happened. You're going to get 4 or 5 different answers.
Right.
And, it's that you think you're paying attention, but you're not. One of the old tricks that people use in cases is a lawyer will wear the same tie for 4 days in a row. And then, you're talking to the jury at the very end. I've never done this, but I've seen it. And then you turn around, the lawyer turns around, puts his coat over and says, or her coat, and said, if she wears a tie, and says, I've worn the same tie for the last 40 days. Do you know what it is? Can you describe it to me? And you obviously don't poll the jury at that point, but somebody on that jury said, man, I haven't paid attention to that at all. Really, because it's not important and it's not what we were focused on. But the point is that there's different human, perceptions. And that's exactly the problem. If you have 1 million people and you saw Revelation, you've got at least 1 million different versions of what happened.
Right, absolutely.
It's a classic film, Rashomon.
Yeah, and it's a great film. And then Paul Newman was in it later. The outrage.
All right, so the primary Jewish metaphor is that God spoke to a community at Sinai. Okay, if you understand the metaphorical nature of that claim, you've opened up a gap with the traditionalist position, which is irreparable, because the Torah text is seen as primarily the creation of a human community, even if it is a response to a real divine event, right? And so I want to talk about, so there's Kaplan here,
Right.
and then there's Rosenzweig and Heschel, who are close to each other. And then more recently, there is a school of thought which is known variously as postmodernism, textual reasoning, or post-critical. Okay, and that's where I sort of situate myself, and I think I'm leaning more towards the term post-critical now, which is to say that all of I must say that I started rabbinical school thinking that I was gonna focus on Bible and maybe even go on to get a PhD in Bible, because I loved Bible as an undergraduate, even though my degree is in international relations. I hated the study of Bible in rabbinical school, okay, because it was, I sometimes say, when I went to seminary in the 1880s, and people will look at me and they say, "You mean the 1980s?" The same. Okay.
Yeah, it didn't go anywhere.
It really, I mean, it was about grammar and linguistics, and questions of the meaning and the significance of the text were completely out of bounds. Okay, I mean, I went to school in the last extant pre-war German university, right? I mean, that's what the teaching of Bible was when I was, and I went to HUC, but it was exactly the same at JPS. It was this dry, scientific, and it was of no interest to me. No interest to me at all. Okay. Having said that, all of that stuff is valid, okay? And it can be a useful tool to understand the text, right? But it doesn't exhaust the ways that we can study the text, right? I mean, now, once you say that that stuff is valid and worthwhile, again, you're no longer fully a traditionalist, right? But, the central conceit of that method is that any particular text has one and only one meaning, right? Which is the meaning that was intended by the author, right? Whether that's an author with a capital A or a small a, right? And that, through the proper application of the scientific method, you can arrive at that original and eternal meaning. And it's just not true.
I was just going to say, you say that glibly, but I don't think that's true at all.
No, I don't either. I don't either. But that was the assumption behind the teaching of Bible in the 1880s when I went to rabbinical school. So post-critical says, all of that is valid and it's true and it can help us understand the text, but we're not imprisoned by it, okay? And we read the text with a sort of second naivete, okay? As if we had never studied that stuff at all.
But that's the cutting edge now in philosophy. I know,
right.
Semantics and breaking it down, and what are we really talking about? Meta, whatever it is, whatever you're studying, whether it's meta ethics or meta whatever, but it's the prior before you can get to the. And you've talked about that during these sessions when you say, well, the Hebrew says this, but and I know that the one we had a prayer that don't let you go astray by your eyes or seduced by your heart. And I thought that was great. And then you said, well, no, that's not what the Hebrew says. I'm a darn.
Right.
But that's exactly where we are here. And I think we're back to where we started. It's a false construct. And it's not a binary system.
Right. Right. No.
Yeah, these things have different meanings at different times.
Right. But beyond that, I mean, it's interesting that I had this experience in rabbinical school, because I think I I mentioned, I mean, I know I've mentioned it. I don't remember if I mentioned it 2 weeks ago or not, but an experience that I actually had in my first year of rabbinical school, where I was in the advanced Hebrew section, and we had a class in Hebrew poetry, taught by a second level Israeli poet, let's say. And I don't mean that, in any disrespectful way. He was an important poet, but not
the top, right.
not the top. But he was very friendly with Yehuda Amichai, who was without fear of contradiction the greatest poet in the history of the state of Israel. And one day, Amichai came to our class and when I say class, I mean this was a seminar. There were 8 of us in the class, okay? And we knew that Amichai was coming, and the professor had us prepare a couple of Amichai's poems before the class. And then we're reading one, and one of my classmates says, well, when you say this, I think what you mean is blah, 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 blah. Is that right? And Amichai says, lo chashuv, doesn't matter.
I remember you telling this
Right.
story.
Right.
Doesn't matter. Okay? Once I have published the poem, it belongs to you as much as it belongs to me. And if you see that in the text, it's in there, whether I intended to put it in there or not.
What's in there for you?
Well, he said it's in there.
Yeah, yeah.
Right?
You could consider.
It's in there. And I think that we have to read the Torah in the same way,
Yeah.
right? That the Torah, lo b'shamayim hi, right? It's not in heaven. The Torah doesn't belong to God anymore.
No, it belongs to us.
It belongs to us, right? And so its authority is not really in the fact of it coming from God, right? And that's what Heschel says, okay? That at Sinai, 2 different things happened, right? God gave the Torah, but Am Yisrael said, Na'aseh v'nishma, right? We will do and we will hear. We will do and we will understand. That it's not only the giving of the Torah, it's the accepting of the Torah, right? I mean, there's no contract, right? There's no contract without offer and acceptance, right? So there's no covenant without revelation and acceptance, right? And so, it's a great paradox, right? That we have 2 holidays that celebrate pretty much the same thing, right? We have Shavuot and we have Simchat Torah, right? But, at least one Hasidic commentary that I read said, no, not really. Shavuot is about God giving the Torah, and Simchat Torah is about Israel accepting the Torah.
Right. But a contract in law is an offer and acceptance with consideration. That's the definition.
Right.
Of course, the great joke for that is guys arguing in appellate court, and he says, contract is offer and acceptance with consideration. And judge leaned over and he said, Mr. Smith, you can assume we know that. And he said, Your Honor, I assume that the judge on the lower level understood it, and that's why. But the philosophical question for that, if that's what a contract is, there's no question what the consideration is for the people who accept the word. What's the consideration for the deity?
It's no king without a kingdom.
All right.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Right? No king without a kingdom. Right?
Yeah.
Right? You will be my people and I will be your God.
Right. That's the covenant. Yeah,
Right.
I don't know.
Right? I mean, the consideration of the covenant is the covenant itself.
Right.
Right? And that's the Jewish myth, okay? And here's where you have to be careful, because in colloquial parlance, myth means something that's not true.
Right.
But in anthropological terms, a myth doesn't mean it's not true, right? It means it is the central tale which organizes our view of the world, right? So the Jewish myth, God created the world, brought the people out of bondage, revealed the Torah, and is ultimately to redeem us and the entire world, right? Remember Siddur class, creation, revelation,
Right.
redemption, right? And the first person to really identify those three ideas in the Siddur and articulate it in that way was Franz Rosenzweig. Okay, and so this myth is true if it works for us. And it has worked for us for close to 3,000 years, right? So, you know, for me, and this is why, and so if you situate yourself in a post-critical place, you could, in theory, be fully orthodox in your observance without being fully orthodox in your belief. Right now, clearly, that doesn't describe me, but it could, right? That the reason for observance is not "Thus saith the Lord," but this is what Israel has accepted, right? Okay, so if you're interested, right, I want to quickly go through some different non-Orthodox views of what?
Was that the handout that you gave us before? Maybe not. I honestly,
I might have given it out last spring. I might have given it out last spring. I'm not sure. All right. So Elliot Dorff, in his source book on conservative Judaism, came up with a handy-dandy chart which described some of the different perspectives on revelation within, well, he has orthodoxy as well, but yes, that is and the various non-orthodox. And you know, you can challenge it because the differences are subtle, right? But you know, typically now partially this is because Dorff is a conservative rabbi, but also because conservative Judaism is the most really diverse of all of the movements, right? I mean, and of course, all of the movements are really spectrums, right? And you can certainly have, I mean, there's a place on the end of, in either sense, where, you know, conservative and orthodoxy can overlap, although less so today than, say, 50 years ago. And certainly where reform and conservative can overlap as well. But so conservative one, God in fact dictated his will at Sinai and at other times. These revelations were written down by human beings, however, and hence the diverse sources of biblical literature. However, since the revelation to Moses was by far the clearest and most public, it is the most authentic recording of God's will. Okay, but Jewish law and theology are to be identified with the ways in which the rabbis of each generation interpreted and applied the laws of the Torah. Hence, the authority of Jewish law is based upon the fact that it is God's will as stated first in the Torah and then by rabbis of each generation. Rabbis are authorized to modify the law for their time, but only with extreme caution. Right? So this is the most sort of traditionalist approach within conservative Judaism. Right? And in essence, where it differs from liberal orthodoxy is simply in its acceptance of the fact that there could be, you know, errors or misreadings within the text. Now, we will talk about halakha under a different rubric, so I don't want to get too bogged down in that. But the idea that Jewish law and theology are to be identified with the ways in which the rabbis of each generation interpreted and applied the laws of the Torah, that is normative as well. I mean, I'll give you a classic example, okay? The law of the rebellious son, right? The law of the rebellious son, which basically says, if a man has a son who's stubborn and rebellious, right, you take him out to the elders of the city, and his parents say, this our son, blah, 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 and then he can be stoned to death, right? And if that law was put into effect literally, nobody would survive their adolescence, right? Nobody would survive their adolescence, right? But now, so we could look at it and say, well, that's just crazy. It's immoral. It's ridiculous, right? Now, the rabbis of the tradition can't look at it and say this is crazy, it's immoral, it's ridiculous, right? But what do? They limit it so that it can't be implemented, okay? For example, and I don't want to go into all the details, right? But the text says the parents have to say, he does not listen to our voice. Our voice, both parents, right? So even on a metaphorical level, which I think is actually very good parenting advice, there has to be one parental voice, right? I mean, if you constantly have two parents giving two different messages, and then the kid gets rebellious, it ain't necessarily just the kid's fault, right? But then the rabbis take it very literally, okay? That in order to implement this law, if you were listening, blindfolded, if you could tell whether that was the father or the mother speaking, they don't have the same voice, right? They have to have literally the same voice, okay? And since voice is impacted by our body, our size and weight, they have to be the same height and the same weight and so on and so forth, okay? And finally they say, lo hayav v'lo nivra. Never happened. This law was never put into practice and was never meant to put into practice. Okay, now, in this sense, I'm results-oriented, right? I mean, do I think that that's what God intended when he revealed the law? No. Do I think that they're reading it accurately? No. Okay, do I care? Also no, right? I mean, the fact is that they couldn't look at this and say, oh, this is bad, we're not doing this. So they got rid of it, right? That's the point. They got rid of it, right? So from an academic perspective, I can say, well, it was their sense of morality, and it certainly doesn't accord with our sense of morality, right? But the point is that, the consensus of the wisdom of the Jewish people eliminated this law, right? The consensus of the wisdom of the Jewish people essentially eliminated capital punishment in all cases, right? So I can sort of academically say there's a history, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they interpreted the original intention of the author correctly, right? But it doesn't matter, right? And this mirrors arguments, between the Federalist Society and other schools of thought in American law as well, right? Original intent versus a living Constitution, right? Now, all traditional Jews would come down on the side of the living Constitution, but they would insist that the living Constitution was actually the original intent. Right?
Yeah, I think that's right.
Okay.
But you know what you're talking about, I don't want to get on this at all, but that's the idea of honor killings and all that sort of thing in other civilizations. The idea that they can kill a child who won't marry who they want to or whatever. They go to disgrace.
Right.
And that's that mentality.
All right. So I'm going to run through this really quickly. Conservative 2, human beings wrote the Torah at various times and places, hence the diverse documents, laws, and ideas in the Torah, but they were divinely inspired. Okay, so conservative 1, it came from God, but written down by human beings. Second, written down by human beings, but divinely inspired. Right? Third, conservative is that it's the Rosenzweig-Heschel perspective, right? Revelation is the disclosure of God, not the declaration of specific rules or ideas, but rather a meeting place between God and humanity in which they get to know each other. Okay, and then, so that's the 3 different schools of thought within conservative Judaism. Then you have Reconstructionism, which I mentioned at the beginning, right? It is entirely a human product. There is no such thing as revelation. There's discovery. There's not revelation, there's discovery. Okay. And then the Reform perspective is progressive revelation. The Torah is God's will written by human beings. As time goes on, we get to understand God's will better and better. Right? Now, again, Reform is also very diverse, and and part of the problem for Reform Judaism, is, I don't have to do that, I'm Reform, right? In other words, people associate with Reform with lack of observance, lack of caring. That's not the ideology of Reform Judaism, right? Now that may point to a flaw in the ideology of Reform Judaism, right? But it's certainly not. Reform Judaism certainly doesn't teach, you don't have to do that because you're Reform, right? I mean, at least the classic belief of Reform Judaism is in progressive revelation. Okay, I mean, you can put it, I mean, certainly, the classic perspective of Reform Judaism was that you could distinguish between the ritual laws and the moral laws. Okay, and the moral laws are eternally valid, but the ritual laws were given for a specific time and place and are no longer valid. The problem that I have with that perspective is, just like, as I said a while ago, right, the minute you put any human admixture, right, then where do you draw the line?
Yeah, that's
right? How do you determine, for example, if you asked a Reform rabbi 50, 60 years ago, okay, so we can distinguish between the ritual and the moral laws, right? Which one is the prohibition of homosexuality? They would have said, that's a moral prohibition, right? Today, I view it essentially as a ritual prohibition. Right? Not a moral prohibition. Even if you accept the idea that the Torah bans homosexual behavior, doesn't mean it's immoral. Any more than eating pork is immoral, or working on Saturday is immoral, right? And nobody denies, whether they follow it or not is a different matter. Nobody denies that the Torah forbids pork and working on Saturday, right? But whether that's a moral violation or a ritual violation is in the eyes of the beholder,
And how about the lineage thing with them? That you're Jewish if your father was
If your
Jewish.
Mother.
Mother,
Your
and then
mother,
reformed will go to
right.
father.
Yeah, but that's
Right.
a
Well,
long
but that's,
thing
look,
later.
Right.
that's complicated, all right? I just as soon not deal with it. Maybe we'll get there.
But I guess my thought was what you just said. You know, if you start changing certain things, where does it end? Or like, why do they have the right to change it? Like, who do they think they are? You know, kind of thing.
Right. I mean, I guess my objection to that is and we'll talk more about this when we get to halakha, okay, is that we have to be careful, particularly careful when what we do has implications beyond the walls of our community. Okay, so that's especially laws of marriage, divorce, conversion, right? In other words, if somebody comes out of the mikveh, the Beit Din does not say to them, congratulations, you're now a conservative Jew. Right? And congratulations, you're a Jew. Right? And therefore, from my perspective, it is our obligation to do that in a proper halachic way. I am under no illusions that the Orthodox will accept my conversions, but I also have no problem saying they're wrong, right? Whereas if I started mucking around with the rules for conversion, then they wouldn't be wrong, right? I want them to be wrong, not me be wrong, right? And the problem, with that particular issue is that you have now tens or hundreds of thousands of people who have been raised as Reform Jews, who the rest of the Jewish world does not consider Jewish or not fully Jewish, and they don't even know, right? In other words, look, when I convert somebody, I tell them, my conversion is a fully halachic proper conversion. I am 100% confident of that. However, the chances that the Orthodox community will accept this conversion as valid is slim to none. But that's on them, not on me. If I started changing and say, you're not circumcised, well, okay, I'll convert you anyway. Oh, you're afraid of water, you don't want to go to the mikveh, I'll convert you anyway. Then it's no longer on them. Then it's on me. Right? And so, I think we have to be very, very careful in matters of personal status. Right? Like, I'll give you, and I'll wrap up with this. Okay, so when my dad got married, my parents are divorced. I mean, my mom is now deceased, but that was very recent, right? My parents are divorced. My dad is remarried. I officiated at their wedding. Now, at that time, I was actually in the process of switching from Reform to conservative affiliation, right? Now, as a conservative rabbi, I may not officiate at a second marriage unless there's been a get. Simply put, I may not. It's not a judgment call. Okay, but I wasn't yet officially conservative, right? So it was really my own conscience, right? And giving a get is not a simple experience, right? It's not endlessly difficult, but it's not simple either. And my dad really didn't want to deal with it. He really didn't want to deal with it. And he said, believe me, it's not the money, okay? Because I don't know, at the time it was, I think, $500. It's probably more now. He said, believe me, it's not the money, okay? I'll give $500 to any charity you want me to. I just really don't want to have to do this. And I said, I'm sorry. I can't. There's nothing that I can do. If you want to get somebody else to be the rabbi for your wedding, I won't be mad. But I cannot perform this wedding until you've given mom a get. Just can't do it. right? And it doesn't matter whether I agree with it or not, right? It doesn't matter whether I agree with it or not. I think our integrity within Klal Yisrael, within the Jewish people, demands of us that we follow the traditional rules and forms when we're dealing with personal status, right? Whereas, you know, if we have a situation where a kid just can't learn their whole Haftorah, right, so we'll do just half, right? Now, there may be some people in the shul who don't like it, but it doesn't affect the rest of the Jewish.
Sure.
But it doesn't affect the rest of the Jewish people the way that having somebody who is considered a Jew here but not here
Yeah.
affects the Jewish people.
Right.
Somebody who's married here and an adulterer here affects the Jewish people, right? However long the Haftorah is, that really affects only us, right? And that's the difference. Okay? Good night, folks. Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you. One question is, you said if it's not